You're listening to The Creative Imposter, episode 134. Welcome to The Creative Imposter. I'm Andrea Klender. How's it going navigating political conversations these days? Oh, don't worry. You didn't accidentally stumble upon a political podcast when you were looking for a creative lifestyle podcast, but we are talking today about talking about politics creatively. I met podcaster Josh Lewis a few years ago when I was seeking guests for my other show, Podcast Envy. Josh's podcast is called Saving Elephants, and nope, it is not a show about the environment. Rather, it's about millennials reigniting conservatism. And you might be thinking, if you know me well, Andrea, I thought you were more liberal, left-leaning, or possibly you've never really even thought about it at all. And that's the point, kind of. How do we find creative ways to have conversations with folks who have differing political views and opinions from us, especially in this current climate, which many in the media are describing with phrases like more polarized than never before? Now, let the record show. I'm talking about reasonable, quote unquote, folks. I don't mean extremists. I definitely don't mean toxic social media threads of people arguing and spewing untruisms, or people causing real harm due to any of the isms like racism, sexism, etc. I reached out to Josh earlier this year because I caught wind of something that he was trying, a way to at least attempt to bridge the gap. Following the events of 2020 in the United States, leading into the January 6th, 2021 attempted insurrection, debatable as to whether that's the right word to use depending on who you ask, but you know what I mean, in Washington, D.C. And Josh invited his liberal political friend, David Blatt, because he's actually the one that instigated and co-organized this event, now series of events that I'm speaking about. Though recorded this past spring, I thought now would be the perfect time to hear this conversation with Josh and David as we move into the winter holiday season. Interactions and conversations with family members and friends who may hold frustratingly different positions from us. Also because New Year's is a great time to check in on our values and assess exactly how we want to be showing up in relation to the other people in the world in the year ahead. You can, of course, read more about Josh Lewis and David Blatt and find links to connect with them in the show notes for this episode in your listening app and at thecreativeimposter.com/134. And while we're talking about show notes, there are just a couple more things I want to quickly tell you about that you will also find linked there. I've just launched another brand new podcast for all the aunts, aunties, tias, TTs, and any other titles you may hold, but you know who you are. It's called Improve with Auntie, and our very first episode is out now, featuring a roundtable of aunties dishing on winter holidays, gifts, traditions, advice, and more. Find the goods at improvewithauntie.com and make sure you follow the show. New episodes are coming in 2022. And one of the many new things I'm personally implementing in my creative business in 2022 is private podcasts that you can access directly in your favorite podcast app. Private meaning there's something special about you that means you get access to this exclusive content that isn't readily available to the masses. And we at the Creative Imposter Studios are partnering with Hello Audio. Let me tell you something. This whole private podcast thing, it isn't just for podcasters. Hello Audio makes it super easy to create premium podcast content that you can use for email list opt-in incentives, memberships, courses, masterminds, teams, and more. Right now, you can try Hello Audio for free for 7 days at thecreativeimposter.com/Hello Audio. And if you decide to sign up, they'll send a little thank you bonus to me for the introduction to you. Again, that's thecreativeimposter.com/Hello Audio, linked in the show notes. And if this is something that you're curious about, it sounds intriguing, but you're like, I'm not really sure how I could use this in my creative business, send me an email. I'd love to share some ideas. And now let's get back to Josh and David. The beginning of this interview may sound a little awkward, and that's because they had just made a joke about how the story of how they met was so boring we should skip it. But I asked anyway. P.S. It's not that boring. I am curious to know the boring details of how the two of you came to be friends.
This goes back, I'm guessing 7, 8 years. But Josh and I were both participants in a Saturday morning running group. And once upon a time, I was part of the fast running group and managed to keep up with Josh for at least short stretches of a mile or two. And we just started talking, as people tend to do on long runs, and discovered that he worked for the state auditor's office and I ran a policy think tank. And we sort of had some intersecting connections and interests. And just over the course of, several weeks until he outran me and I dropped off, we had conversations and developed a bit of a friendship.
Yeah, and I think the friendship was furthered, of course, in that not too long after we met, our office actually moved into the building where you officed. And we would occasionally have conversations outside of or by the men's room. And it seemed like even though we came from different sides of the political spectrum, we were able to bond over some of the silliness that was taking place in the state budgetary battles at that time.
There was always lots of silliness.
And so tell our listeners, what are those differences politically between the two of you?
So I'm a pretty committed liberal or progressive politically. I can't say I've been a lifelong Democrat because I actually moved to the US for graduate school from Canada. So I'm a native Canadian, but grew up supporting the Canadian Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Party in Canada. Once I moved to the US, was a supporter of the Democratic Party. And then once I became a citizen about 15 years ago, have consistently voted for Democrats, although with a couple of exceptions for some local races. So that's my background.
As you probably guessed, I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum, lifelong Republican. I don't know what kind of caveats to give because I feel like over the last 4 or 5 years, the earth has shifted beneath my feet. I don't feel like I've changed that much, but I feel like my party has changed considerably. I would like to think in some ways I've become more conservative, but less radical.
Say more about that. What does that mean?
The polarization we're witnessing, I've always felt that I was a conservative, but over the last 4 or 5 years, specifically with the advent of Donald Trump, there was this whole sense of, well, what does conservatism actually mean? It seems like all these people I thought I was in pretty close harmony with meant something a little different about it when they would say it. So what do I mean by this? And I actually went back and started reading the old founders of the William F. Buckley, or even further back with Russell Kirk, or even clear back to Edmund Burke, and realized there was this enormous wealth of information of this very proud heritage of this intellectual tradition that I just really knew nothing about. And it seemed to be very much out of step with where a lot of the, I guess what I would sometimes call bumper sticker philosophy of the way we often speak in politics is these days. And so in some sense, I felt like I became more dedicated to conservatism as an intellectual movement, while at the same time feeling as if I was going increasingly alienated with the political party that claims to serve a conservative agenda.
I feel like a lot of times we grow up identifying with a political party, often the political party of our parents or our families, and we just kind of find ourselves in a certain circle. Or, I mean, my parents have always voted Democrat that I know of, and I have a pretty liberal leaning toward progressive circle of friends where it's actually like sometimes I'm friends with someone and we don't ever talk about politics, and then I'll realize that they're more conservative or that they voted Republican, and I'm like, I don't even know you anymore. Like I have this like, oh, because there's this polarization that has come up where it's like an us and them mentality. And if I'm friends, clearly you believe the same thing as me. But then also, what does that actually even mean? I don't know that I could give you a very clear definition of what liberalism is. I probably, from listening to some of your episodes, Josh, could probably describe conservatism better now than I could liberalism.
Well, good.
Actually. So I'm like, wait, where's the podcast that helps me understand my own political leanings better from like more of a historical standpoint too?
And I'm not sure that I can answer that question either. I definitely identify as a liberal. I led a policy think tank in Oklahoma Policy Institute, which definitely was liberal leaning. Although
Mhm.
being the liberal think tank in a extremely conservative state, we were very wary of labels and did everything we could to avoid labeling ourselves or being labeled by others, because the L word in Oklahoma can be quite dangerous and damaging. So
Hmm.
we always preferred to identify ourselves by the values that we promoted, the policies that we promoted, but they typically corresponded to what most see as liberal, which is a more active and interventionist role for government, particularly to try to expand opportunity and equality for low-income folks in particular. That's where we worked. That's how we selected the issues that we got engaged in. Is did they try to expand opportunities for low-income Oklahomans? I worked on a range of policy issues. I've left the think tank, but I'm now teaching public policy. And the issues that I'm most concerned with, definitely approach from what I would call a liberal perspective, which generally says looking to government to play a role in trying to reduce inequalities and expand opportunities. What are the policy issues out there? What are the alternatives that we have, and which approach would seem to be best at tackling the problems that I see as being most pressing?
You're making me think of something that, let me see if I've got this right, Josh, that I have learned from Josh, actually, or at least reframed, which is that for most of my life, I felt like if you vote Democrat in the US, you are pro saving the environment, you are pro social justice. And yet, if you vote Republican, you're anti-equal rights. I mean, this sounds really ridiculous, but I really thought this. I really thought like, oh, Republicans do not want equal rights for women. Oh, Republicans do not want equal rights for people of color. That was all the programming that I grew up with. And, like let's take climate change, for example, or environmental issues. I was like, oh, the Republicans don't care about climate change. They don't care about the environment, and the Democrats care. And what has shifted in my understanding, I'm embarrassed to say that this shifted in my late 30s, is it's not that Republicans don't care about the environment. What the difference is between the conservative way of looking at it and the liberal way of looking at it is, here is the problem, here is the issue, but how are we going to approach that issue? Or what is the role of government in addressing this issue versus it's an issue or it's not an issue, or we're pro or we're against? Does that make sense? Is there a better way to explain it than what I just did?
Well, if there's a better way to explain it than what you just did, I'm not sure what that is. I mean, these are obviously infinitely complicated issues, and I think sometimes we're reduced to just trying to simplify it, which you did very well. I would agree with that. I think there's a tendency to view the other side, if we could simplify it like that, as having almost a maniacal, at best uncaring or ignorant, and at worst an almost evil view towards what we want. Whereas in reality, I think, and look, there are certainly bad actors on both sides in a certain degree, but I think it's more a disagreement with fundamental values about human nature and equality and order. And I think that the absolute simplest definitions I've ever heard of the, say, conservative progressive paradigm, if you will, was that a conservative is someone whose chief concern is about a lack of gratitude. That basically, if you boil us down, we're relatively intelligent, hairless apes, but in absence of civilization, that's basically all we are. And so we ought to be immensely grateful and careful to preserve the things we have, because they can be taken from us and they're not easy to build up. Whereas conversely, a progressive is someone that is chiefly concerned about justice, and instances in which those who are, I don't want to say necessarily just equality, but instances in which the strong are oppressing the weak. Or there are cases, I'm not a progressive, so maybe I'm not defining that well. But I guess my point here being, both of those are very reasonable viewpoints. And I think to a certain degree, both of those are things that people have to have, a sense of both gratitude, but also a desire to see that justice is done. It's just, how do we filter these things? And ultimately, they end up infusing themselves into highly complex worldviews that can butt heads with one another.
I think one way to present the liberal position would be, when we look at a problem, we're inclined to say, how can we make it better? Mm-hmm. And Josh may be suggesting that for conservatives, the first concern is, how do we not make it worse?
Yeah, I think I've heard it said that the progressive looks for solutions, the conservative looks for trade-offs. I don't think it's all this, but sometimes I wonder how much of it is just simple personality differences. I am by nature a rather pessimistic person. And sometimes the dreary conservative is always worried about the budget. It's natural for us to say, well, what's going to go wrong if we try it this way?
Sure.
And so how did we get to this point where, I mean, in listening to some other podcasts, I probably listen to more liberally minded podcasts than I do conservatives. Yours is one of the only conservative podcasts I've tried to listen to that I can stomach, to be honest, because some of them I'm like, in 5 minutes, I'm clenching my fists and wanting to like do damage to something. But I've heard a lot of this thinking around how we have what they call perception gaps, which is exactly what we're talking about, where we have created a perception of what the other side is doing, or we've created a perception of who the person in the other party is. How did we get to this point where we have this sort of polarized us versus them mentality and these huge gaps in how we perceive somebody who is quote unquote on the other side of the political divide?
So I think we could spend hours on this, and there have been an increasing number of really sharp books that have been written about the question of how do we become so polarized, and why are we so polarized. And I think there is a consensus that polarization is at extreme levels in the United States, and whether it's worse than ever before in history is certainly debatable. There was a civil war, there was a lot of unrest in the 1960s, but by a lot of measures we are at record levels of polarization. And there's a lot that's contributed to it. Some of the explanations that I have found most interesting and compelling do look at the media landscape and compare the long period after World War II, where you had a media landscape with 3 national TV networks that were all essentially playing to the median viewer and the median voter. And that really helped keep things in the middle, in the mainstream. You also saw that with print media, where you had most people reading, 1 or 2 local newspapers. And what we've seen in the last several decades with the splintering of the media landscape, with the emergence of cable news that really began to see politics more as entertainment and trying to drive an audience. And so you have niche broadcasting that is on the left and on the right, and you don't have as many spaces where people not only come together where they can share common opinions, but even where you have the same facts. And increasingly, there's just this lack of agreement on what the facts are. And whether you are watching Fox or MSNBC, you're getting a whole different set of facts. Depending on when you are on social media, algorithms are driving you towards opinions and sources that are most in line with what you already believe. So I think there's a big role where you can look at the nature of the media that is driving us further and further apart, and it just keeps snowballing and escalating and feeding off each other to the point where we really don't even agree on just some basic tenets of what the facts are.
I don't know that I would in any way disagree with what David said. I guess I would say I would simply add to it. And first of all, there have been scores, volumes of books written on this by people so much more intelligent than I am. And Andrea, that's a darn good question. Why are we where we are today? To what extent is it worse today than what, I mean, it seemed like perceptively, I think Americans are correct to think our polarization problems seem to be getting worse and worse by a number of alarming measurements, or just sort of anecdotal evidence of who we can think of in our daily lives. I think we could pick numerous other explainers, say. The other big one I would point to is some sort of a sense and a breakdown or an alienation in who we are as individuals within our communities. And I say that because it is true that historically speaking, we've seen an explosion in media, and the media has not helped with our polarization. But so too when we first became a country. I mean, if you look back and read some of the articles that were written in the old newspapers shortly after our founding, they would almost make everything we have today look like PBS by comparison. I mean, they're just vicious with their just outright lies and libel against the party sometimes. And obviously, we had a civil war. But I guess where I'm going with this is I think humans have always struggled with this sort of us versus them potential. What we've also witnessed is sort of an alienating world in which, if you go back 1,000 years and you ask people in Europe what they thought about people in the Middle East, I don't know that it would have been severely tolerant, but they weren't necessarily interacting with people in the Middle East in any global sense like we are today. We have such an interconnected world. We have such a large growing a multicultural society, it's really difficult, I think, for us to understand how I think people have described this as the fourth industrial revolution, this age of communication, when every smo that has an internet account can come up with an opinion, and the next thing you know, it makes national news. Humans have not had to function like this before, and I hope we figure it out. But I think that we're going to have to find ways to reinvent communities so that we have some sort of sense of a groundedness of here is what's important. And it's not just always me against the world and I need to live in such fear and animosity.
Let me just add one point. I know Andrew wants to jump in. I think the fact that we have such growing economic inequality in the United States is contributing to that as well, where you just have this huge gap between the top and the bottom. A lot of the inequality is being driven by different opportunities for those with a college degree versus those without a college degree. And we see in all kinds of areas that really all the gains of the last several decades have accumulated for those with college degrees. And I think as our society has become more economically polarized, that has really contributed to political polarization as well, that there's just less places where we come together. Our neighborhoods are more segregated. Our workplaces are more segregated. We tend to marry and socialize among others like us. And I think, if you compare that to that post-war period where there was a really strong middle class of people who didn't necessarily have a college degree, and you just had more opportunities, more places where people who were unlike each other in various ways were able to come together. Now, there were obviously lots of populations excluded from that, especially African Americans and other minorities. But I do think that it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this high level of political polarization at the same time as we're seeing economic inequality at historically high levels.
So we have a roadmap here that looks at media, that looks at globalization of, this is so funny when you're talking about how I don't like this word tribal for a lot of reasons, but we tend to identify with a certain group, we humans, people. We have possibly always had these barriers between our tribe of people and then whoever else is different or other or far away, but we never were like interacting all in this big globalized communication landscape before. And I work with high school students from the south and west side of Chicago, and we were talking about racism in our program the other day, and one of the students said, "Why do we even have racism? Like, why is this even a thing?" And I was like, I don't know
whose idea was that?
Yeah, like who came up with this thing? And so we were kind of trying to look at like what are some of the reasons why this might exist. And then somebody said, "Well, could we ever not have it? Could it ever go away, or is it just something we're stuck with forever and ever?" And one of the students said, "We're stuck with it forever because people are basically hypocrites and scumbags." I was like, oh my, this is a very nihilistic viewpoint that you have. But basically looking at like human nature, like there is a human nature element of self-preservation, of not being comfortable or being fearful even of things that are different than. We also talked about just now economics, and there's so many different factors going in, but I'm curious about something that you said, Josh, about identity. You said the phrase, who we are as individuals in our communities. And I think that points to something that's important on this podcast that we talk a lot about, is this intersection of like who we are, how we identify ourselves, and what we choose to do, whether it be what we choose to create or the work that we choose to do or actions that we choose to take. I'm wondering if you can say more about that when you say who we are as individuals in our communities. Is this a problem? Is the way that we identify leading to more polarization and more opposition, or is this a potential like solution or a potential bridge opportunity? Does that make sense?
I think so, if I understand where you're going with that. And I would say it is both. It's, the word that you want to avoid, and I understand it completely, tribalism, and this is going to come from what our view of human nature is, or maybe some that would disagree with it, but I don't think you get away from tribalism. Whether or not you have a religious framework, which I do, that humans are by nature the way we are, or whether you want to purely explain it through a Darwinian biological standpoint of the human species wouldn't exist if we were just completely trusting of those that didn't look or act like us. That there was some sort of evolutionary advantage to this. I don't know that we escape this, and that's very sad news. But that's not hopeless, because I think what's needed is not necessarily an elimination of tribalism. I think what's needed are healthier tribes and more tribes. I think if people had a greater quantity of ways to relate to the world than just it's me and it's, from an American perspective, the individual, and then there's the federal government, and there's nothing in between those two. I think that is a very dangerous paradigm where it's easy for a demagogue to take control because it's so alienating and so frightening if it's me versus the world. Whereas if, and I personally have a lot of tribes. I'm sure you do too. I'm a son. I'm a brother. I'm a Christian. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. I'm an Oklahoman. I'm an American. I play a banjo. I enjoy drinking tea. David and I share a tribe in running. There are lots of ways from down to the completely frivolous on up to what it actually I think is most important in my life that I identify myself. And I think the more we can strengthen what is healthy about those, certainly things such as religious institutions, families, and local communities, that place where we derive value and meaning in our own lives, I think that is one of the greatest weapons against the dangers of polarization and potential demagoguery we could be experiencing.
So the problem is that increasingly all those identities that we have are tending to fall in the same camp, and they all are aligned with our political identities. So that way more than it used to be, that if you know how often somebody attends church or doesn't attend church, you can predict with some confidence their political affiliation. If you know what television station they watch, you can predict their political affiliation, which may seem obvious in an era of Fox News and MSNBC, but in 30 years ago, if I said I watched NBC and you watched ABC, it's not going to give away that much about who we would support for politics. Increasingly, if you ask, what car do you drive? Do you drive a pickup truck or do you drive a hybrid vehicle? We can go through all of these things where our identities are all overlapping rather than cross-cutting. And that's where the polarization is just becoming more and more extreme, because this is all just reinforcing different worldviews. You're either on the left or you're on the right, and everything that you're doing is just reinforcing that.
So one thing that you two have chosen to do to address some of these issues and concerns is a little project that you cooked up, which is what inspired this conversation when Josh casually mentioned it in an email to me that I casually sent to him. Tell me a little bit about, what did you do?
Well, let me kick it off to you, David, since this was your idea initially.
Sure. So I have become increasingly alarmed by what is happening in the United States, by the breakdown of a democratic consensus. And I think I just have to, be blunt and say that the Trump presidency scared the hell out of me. That there was, I think 4 years of what seemed to me very illiberal, and not with a capital L liberal, but declining support for basic democratic norms and values. It just worried me a lot. And it was very concerning that you had two segments of the population both increasingly convinced that the future of the country was at stake, that depending on what happened in the next election, that we won't have a country anymore, which is a line that you hear a lot. And I made I think, sort of conscious decision to try to get out of my bubble some and at least understand how others were thinking, and particularly found myself drawn to some non-Trump, never Trump conservative thinkers who shared many of the same premises that I do, but also some basic differences. And I would, rather than consuming 100% liberal media diet and listening just to Pod Save America and reading Michelle Goldberg and Paul Krugman. When I picked up the New York Times, I also read Ross Douthat and David Brooks and David from The Atlantic, and discovered David French. I didn't only read people named David, but as it happened, maybe I have a natural affinity.
You're in the David
Um,
tribe.
and realized that there were some reasonable, rational voices coming from the right, and I knew several in my own personal circle who shared some of the major concerns that I had. And so I felt the need in the aftermath of the election, and particularly in the aftermath of the insurrection of January 6th, to say I need for myself some kind of effort to engage in a dialogue with people who I don't share every political belief with, but hopefully share some basic fundamental agreements with, and sort of hatched up this idea that maybe we could get a group of reasonable liberals and a group of reasonable conservatives together to just talk about the fundamental challenges facing the nation. What is America going to look like, and how are we going to pull through this? Because I do think that we are facing a real crisis when you have both sides deeply convinced that the country may not stay together. So that led me to reach out to Josh and suggest just creating a small informal discussion group, bring people together to pick a different reading or magazine article or podcast on a monthly basis and just see where it goes. It wasn't a real grandiose, particularly well thought out thing. I did actually throw together a few sentences, but it wasn't a whole prospectus or proposal. It was just picked up the phone, called Josh and said, would you have any interest in this? Knowing that, having listened to Josh's podcast, that he had some of the very same concerns, was exploring some of the same themes, and was being influenced by many of the same thinkers and analysts that I was.
And what did you think when David proposed this to you?
Well, I was very grateful he would think of me, but part of what I thought, and hearing him talk now, I still think this, that David's thought process and his efforts are commendable, because I think the grave temptation when we witness something like January the 6th, the insurrection on the Capitol, is first to rightly be outraged and to be angered, but it's also to sort of double down in the polarization camps we find ourselves in. And David, I don't know if you'd disagree with this, but from my perspective, you kind of worked against that grain. It was sort of we're not going to get out of this mess by just keep continuously doubling down on what we're doing. And it's not that we're reaching out to those who are actively participants in the insurrection and trying to get them around the campfire. Although, and a friend of mine points this out, and I think it is true, unfortunately, one of the problems we're experiencing, there's not a lot of off-ramps for extremism in this country.
Right.
There's not a lot of grace to find those that I am largely in disagreement with, and they may be totally cool with the insurrection, but they might actually be winnable to a more rational, reasonable viewpoint through process of time. It's really hard. How do we come together? And so I think this is we're not saving the world, but this is the first step in what a lot of us, not just David and I, but a lot of us are going to have to be doing. It's slow and arduous work, and it can be enjoyable, but it's kind of trying to remend those bridges and trying to find ways. I don't have any delusions as to what's going to come from this, as the conservatives and progressives are going to emerge from this thinking we now have perfect agreement on any policy, but an ability to navigate this and try to understand, how do we back down from this sort of almost warlike rhetoric that we see in this polarization.
So you came up with this idea, David. Josh said yes. And then what happened next?
So we each decided to invite a group of friends, basically. And I primarily invited liberal friends, although some of the folks on my list were conservatives. I think Josh primarily invited conservatives. We kind of gave them the 3-sentence description of what we were hoping to do and asked if they were interested. We sent out a little survey through SurveyMonkey and said, "Are you interested?" And sort of just asked some basic questions. And I think there were 28 folks who we sent out invitations to, and 25 or 26 said they were interested, including many who were really, really excited by this.
Mhm.
And even the 2 or 3 who were not, who said no, it was really because of time commitments rather than saying that they thought that this endeavor was misguided or pointless. Now, I think there was a selection bias, in terms of who we chose to invite. I certainly put together my list of folks who I assumed would be open to this kind of discourse. Avoided some of my friends on the left who I know are just maybe more uncompromising, angrier about the right, and more convinced that anybody on the right is just irredeemable. But we invited them to attend a first session where we chose a book to discuss and figured, rather than spend a lot of time off the bat brainstorming about what we're going to be about and coming up with a mission statement and defining our values, goals, and purposes, we just said, let's kind of jump into it. And we chose a book that seemed like a great starting point, which was a recent book by the journalist Anne Applebaum called The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. And we just had our first meeting a few weeks ago. 20 people were able to join, and hopefully this will continue as an ongoing project, but can't say with any certainty of what it'll lead to or where it's going to go.
You met over Zoom in person?
No, it was a virtual meeting.
What was the experience like? What did you observe?
I felt like, given the time constraints and the quantity of the group, I felt like it went very well. And it seemed like people were engaged and interested and making better points than I can make half the time. I did wonder somewhat if the group was holding back just because of those particular constraints. And there's no, you can't get, unless you're going to have a literal all day meeting, you can't get 20 plus people in a room to hash out these very difficult conversations and expect us to get anything resolved or work through things. But I feel like for what it was, it went very well. It didn't seem to descend into any, you could tell David and I crafted some questions. We had everybody introduce themselves. And one of them David came up with, which was brilliant, was your earliest political memory, because I think it helped understand just immediately, where someone was potentially coming from, and also politely ask them how old they are. Without actually asking how old you are. And so, and there was it was an interesting diversity in the group of responses. And I feel like it went pretty well, but I think it's definitely, we're going to need more meetings before maybe I could really flesh out, here's where we're going with these things.
Well, sure. And I was curious about structure, and there was the selection bias, like you were both thoughtful about who you were inviting to the table for this first go around, but also how well or how much did anyone know each other than just either of you?
I would say among the folks who I invited, most of them knew a couple of other people, but nobody knew everybody. My list was mostly all other people in Oklahoma who I have worked with or interacted with, either from my time running the think tank or just within the local Tulsa community. I invited one of my closest college friends from Canada. I thought would add some interesting perspective. I think Josh cast a little more broadly in terms of his invite list.
Well, that was mostly because they were mostly podcasters I was connected with. And I'm similar to David. Most of the people I invited may have known one or two people. A few of them knew of others. They had just very brief interactions with them. But unfortunately, just by nature of what we were doing, these were predominantly people that were either very little acquainted with or not acquainted with most of the group. And we hope through process of time that'll change, obviously. But starting off is kind of where we had to start.
Yeah.
And we had, among the ones who I invited, we had a former Republican state senator. We had a current city councilor. We had a couple of law professors, some folks who I had worked with previously at my think tank from the policy world. So it was, definitely different kinds of backgrounds, but it was not, other than everybody knew either me or Josh, there was no other unifying aspect to it.
Other than perhaps people like holding back and not just full force expressing themselves in the moment, did you come across any other points of tension or anything else that was challenging about conducting the meeting? Or did you have a plan for, like, what if things go awry? What if a fight breaks out? Or did you anticipate anything like that? Or did you have any concerns in the back of your mind of something like this happening?
That's where online is great. No one,
Eject.
no one can actually crack a chair over your head online or actually have. No, I think we really decided to just kind of keep it informal and see where things went. But as Josh said, it was just a first meeting. By the time everybody introduced themselves and just kind of gave a 60-second introduction of who they were, where they lived, et cetera. Then we had 30 minutes to discuss the book. And really it was, everybody kind of shared the uppermost thing on the top of their minds. I think maybe 2 or 3 people were able to speak for a second or third time. So the way we're going to try to do it is one member of the group be the group leader each time, both to select a work to be the focus of the discussion and also serve as moderator. So I kind of treated my role as just looking to see whose hands were up and putting just an order of questions and saying, we're going to hear from Jane and then Glenn will be next and do that. But it was, at least the first meeting was too brief to really get into an exchange. And it is going to raise the question of, like, how can you have a robust and meaningful discussion among 20 people online? It's certainly going to be challenging.
I feel like the main work we did there was actually prior to the meeting. There were a number of people I could have thought to invite who were very thoughtful, very intelligent, but might have increased the temperature. And so I felt like our initial go at it was, well, let's try to get people together who have strong opinions, but have ways in which they can express them that are less likely to devolve into kind of these bickerings.
What I think we don't want to have happen is, sort of make this a local version of your crossfire exchange, where on the left and then on the right, and then it just, where everybody sort of feels like their responsibility is to state their partisan position and score points. And at the end, whoever's won the most points. I don't think we were looking to do that at all. And in fact, we intentionally did not ask people to identify their partisan affiliations in their introductions. Some did, others didn't. I think there were quite a few people in our group. Actually, we did include that in the survey. And I would say close to half didn't identify as Democrats or Republicans. Sometimes they're independent or they were lapsed or just sort of said it's complicated. I think, for a lot of people, partisan affiliations are very much in flux right now. And I think many people are realizing that just sticking a party label onto things is not helpful.
Why is this project of facilitating these conversations important to you personally?
For me, I kind of look at it as vital to my maintaining some faith that the American experiment is still viable. I mean, I really do feel like we are in a extremely dangerous situation and that the forces pulling us apart are growing stronger and stronger. And we saw a armed insurrection against the Capitol on January 6th. We saw a majority of the House Republican caucus refuse to certify the election results. We know that we have a significant minority of the population, a majority of Republicans who believe that Joe Biden was not fairly elected. I think had the results gone the other way, that you would have had a significant number of Democrats who would have been convinced that Donald Trump was not a legitimate leader either. I think we have to do what we can in order to restore dialogue and rebuild bridges. And as I think we've already said, don't have hopes that this little civil discourse discussion group that we're doing for a select group of invitees once a month is going to change the world. If it can create a space for those kinds of discussions and at least reassure ourselves that there are people on the other side who we have common ground with and can talk to and disagree with civilly, and maybe, change one another's minds on some things, if not necessarily everything, that's, I think, healthy for me personally, and I hope, healthy for democracy.
Gosh, I think David said it pretty well. I don't know that I got to add too much other than just to say that we've both said this. We're not changing the world. But I think you can also fall into danger of making too little of these things. As I said earlier, it depends on your view of human nature. I basically think we're really clever, hairless apes that can use tools, if not for civilization that changes us into the civilized people we are. Well, what does that is primarily the conversations we tell ourselves and the conversations we have with each other. And so this is not just talk. This is not just a group of friends getting together. This is the building blocks whereby we can continue an experiment like the great American experiment. And I would even say, David, I am yearning for hope. I am yearning for signs that there's a possibility for a brighter tomorrow. And I think even that can be valuable, because I think holding hope in our hearts is what allows us to weather very difficult things.
Right. And, so much of the public conversation is just driven by the outrage machine, by amplifying the loudest, angriest, most extreme voices, because that's what pays. It pays in better ratings. It pays in larger fundraising yields. But it's sometimes easy to overlook where people are working to come together. But I do think that there are some grounds for hope. So, we're taping towards the end of April, in a week where a jury of 12 ordinary citizens came to a consensus on a very contentious and controversial trial and found Derek Chauvin guilty of the murder of George Floyd. That may have seemed obvious. At the same time, 12 people agreeing on anything is really sort of interesting. You just had the United States Senate on a 99-1 vote support a hate crimes measure regarding Asian Americans. That's not nothing. You have a bipartisan group of senators working on a police reform bill led by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, a Republican, and Congresswoman Karen Bass of California, a Democrat. There are these groups that are trying to work together. It doesn't mean that everything is going to pass on a bipartisan basis or needs to pass on a bipartisan basis, but at least I think these efforts are constructive and do suggest that maybe if you put people together, you can actually find important sources of agreement.
We're coming to a close here. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say or feel like you haven't said before we say goodbye?
I'm never good for answering that question, but I guess the thing that popped into my head is this whole notion of hope and such it needs to be said that this can be enjoyable work. It can also be hard work. And if you are interested in engaging in these kind of conversations, be aware of and be okay with not only being called names, but also probably not seeing the fruits of your labor, at least not quickly. That you have to, I sound like a very negative message, and I don't mean for it to be, but I often, that's what kind of grounds me, is when I think of myself, what actually caused me to change my mind? What actually caused me to hold the values I do? It was never because someone just argued me into it. It was the relationships that were developed over years. And quite frankly, the majority of views I hold, the people that helped put them in my head do not know that they did that. They were never there to witness the person I turned out to be. And this is a challenging project. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think that's where we have to keep in mind, is that to have a very clear-eyed sense of what we're doing and not to lose hope if we don't see that sort of immediate payoff.
I'm just going to offer an amen to what Josh said.
Raise the roof emoji.
There you go.
I had so much fun talking about politics with Josh and David, and I hope it gave you something to think about too. You can find links to all the things we discussed in the show notes at thecreativeimposter.com/134, including a recommended reading list from Josh and David's civil discourse conversations that they have continued to have throughout the year. Here's a follow-up note from Josh that he sent when I asked how it was going. Josh says, "A lot of our meetings have centered around the initial issue that brought us together of political polarization, and we've read material from a number of sources on the matter, such as Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, David French's Divided We Fall, Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized, Martin Geary's Revolt of the Public, Yuval Levin's A Time to Build, a personal favorite of Josh's, and Liliana Mason's Uncivil Agreement. There have been a few meetings discussing more one-off issues from critical race theory to challenges with the legal system administering justice in cases of rape. The discussions at times take on a fairly academic flavor and sometimes a more partisan tone, but I believe we've managed to maintain a healthy balance of debate and civility. If there's one sour note I could add, it's that taking deep dives into the subject of why Americans are polarized and what to do about it can be rather daunting, as one realizes just how vast and seemingly unsolvable the problems are. But then, perhaps that is just my dreary conservative side speaking. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, David. And hey, thank you, listener. Even if you are more liberal or all the way left, I encourage you to go check out Josh's podcast, Saving Elephants. Whenever I get a chance to listen, it always helps me to consider things with a fresh perspective. This episode was mixed by Edwin Ruiz. Our theme music is by Jovia Armstrong. Show notes by Lisa Witter. Special thank you to our new editing apprentice at the Creative Imposter Studios, Kathy Robinson, for editing support on this episode. I'm Andrea Klunder. I thank you so much for listening. And this week, I'm encouraging you to let down your defenses a little bit. Really listen to the person you're talking to and consider that fresh perspective. You might just learn something about yourself.